What's up, guys? We're back and we're breaking down UFC 282, Blachowicz versus Ankalaev. This should be a pretty high level, pretty technical main event, but if I'm being honest, I don't think the levels of excitement and hype are going to be quite the same compared to the original matchup in Teixeira and Prochazka. And with only two more events to close out the year before we take about a month off, I'll take anything they give me at this point. And honestly, the rest of the matchups aren't even that bad. There are some pretty good fights that they have on this card booked, like Mitchell and Topuria. Even Till and Duplessis should be a pretty fun one. And while the bottom half of the card may be a bit lacking in terms of the name value, there are a number of young debuting fighters who do have pretty exciting styles that should lead to some pretty fun finishes earlier in the card. So without further ado, let's get right into the breakdowns for UFC 282. And kicking off the card, we have Cameron Saaiman versus Stephen Koslow. Saiman's the minus 260 favorite. Koslow's the plus 220 underdog. And Koslow is stepping in short notice for this fight. Saaiman was actually initially scheduled to go up against Ronnie Lawrence, which would have been a pretty tough fight for him. But now I feel like he's getting a much easier matchup in Koslow here. But at the end of the day, this is a pretty low-level fight. We have Saaiman, who is coming off of the Contender Series, and if I'm being honest, I don't really know what he does well from a technical standpoint. I remember watching on the Contender Series, he was kind of getting picked apart at distance, and then he got taken down and didn't really know what to do. He was kind of just throwing some open-handed slaps to his opponent's back. And I feel like the only reason he was able to find success later in the fight was when his opponent really started to slow down. I think like halfway through the second round or so, he just had nothing left in the tank, and Saaiman was able to really get off on his offense. And I do think that Saiman's got some pretty decent attributes. He does look like a very aggressive guy. He seems like he's got good cardio. He's very tough. But from a technical standpoint, I do think that he's got quite a bit to work on overall. But, he does have some good attributes that I think could potentially carry him at the UFC level. But, his game is still very green, and, he still is very young. And he's going up against Koslow, who, again, is coming in short notice, filling in for Ronnie Lawrence, who probably would have destroyed Saaiman, if I'm being honest. But back to Koslow here. He does appear to be a pretty grapple-heavy fighter. Wasn't able to find a ton of footage, but generally it looks like he is able to get fights to the ground, and he's usually just looking to hunt submissions there. But the fact is, it does look like Koslow's a bit of a can crusher. I don't really think he's fought anyone of note on the regional scene. And it doesn't look like he's really gotten out of the first round either. So you do have to wonder how his cardio is going to look down the stretch, especially coming in short notice. But as far as a pick goes, I kind of have to side with Saaiman, just given the potential cardio dynamic. We saw Saaiman, he was taking damage early in the fight. He was getting taken down, but he wasn't giving up in there. He still showed aggression, and as soon as his opponent started to slow down, he was starting to pour it on him. And I think that if he is somehow able to survive that first round against Koslow, he could start to, pick it up again and maybe get a second round or third round finish. But the issue is, I do think that Saaiman may be green enough that someone like Koslow could just catch him early with the submission. I don't know how good the submission game of Koslow actually is. He is getting these submission wins early, but again, it is against some pretty low level guys, and I'm just not sure how translatable that is in this matchup. So official pick, I'm going to go with Saaiman. I think that he should be able to survive, past that first round and maybe get a finish in the second round. So official pick, I'll go with Saaiman to win by round 2 ground and pound TKO. And next up, we have Antonio Trócoli versus Ovince St. Preux. And it's a pick'em fight, minus 110 both ways. We'll start with the Trócoli side. So Trócoli making his UFC debut on short notice. But from what I have seen, he does look like a pretty aggressive grappler. But it does seem like he's a bit of a size bully as well. A lot of his opponents, or at least in the fights that I have seen, he's quite a bit bigger than them. A lot of his opponents probably not even belonging in the weight class. And after a couple of years off, it does look like Trócoli's put on even more mass. So you do have to wonder how the cardio is going to look from this guy coming in short notice, who does push a bit of a pace in there. But overall, I don't think this guy is really anything special so far. OSP, though, on the other hand, pretty well-rounded veteran. A guy could do it all right. He could strike a bit. He could wrestle. He's got his signature Von Fluke choke. But the issue is, I think OSP is kind of washed. He hasn't looked really good at all in his last few performances, even in his win against Hua. He was really just spamming that front kick, but wasn't able to really do much else outside of that. It kind of looks like he's starting to crumble a bit under pressure in these fights. So I don't know if OSP's washed to the point where he's going to get beat by some random debuting fighter coming in short notice. I mean, if OSP loses here, I think he should retire, because this is going to be the biggest step down in competition for him at this point. So I don't know if this guy's just in here to pick up a paycheck or what, but OSP's, I think, the all-around better fighter, but at this point you just have to wonder where his head's at. But official pick for this fight, I guess I'll go with OSP. I think I'll pick him to win by maybe round 2 knockout. This Trócoli guy does seem pretty aggressive. I can definitely see him, starting hot and, maybe not being able to get the finish against OSP, maybe gassing out, and then we see OSP mount a bit of a comeback. But, even then, I'm not entirely convinced that OSP still got enough left in the tank and enough aggression to really capitalize. But at the same time, I don't think this Trócoli guy is anything special. So I'm going to go with OSP to win by round 2 TKO. And next up, we have Raul Rosas Jr. versus Jay Perrin. And Rosas is the minus 255 favorite. Perrin is the plus 235 underdog. And so right off the bat, I do think that Rosas is definitely riding the hype here. He's coming off of a very impressive and very dominant grappling performance on the Contender Series. And prior to that, he was just running through guys on the regionals. But the fact is, I do think that Rosas still is kind of green. He's only 6-0, only 18 years old, and has really only faced one semi-decent guy on the Contender Series. And that was the only fight he's gone the distance in, right? He did look good there, but, outside of that, he hasn't gone past the second round. However, I will say that he does seem to have some pretty decent tools to succeed at the UFC level. He does appear to be a very tenacious grappler. The cardio seems to check out, but it is worth noting that, we really only have this one performance to go off of, and, you don't want to overrate a guy, especially a 6-0 guy making his UFC debut after one performance like that. And he's going up against Jay Perrin, who, the guy hasn't had the best UFC run, but it is worth noting that, he did take Batista on pretty short notice, and Batista is a legit fighter, a guy who's quickly climbing the rankings now. I think he's probably in the top 15, maybe in the top 10 at this point. And he's also finishing guys. Granted, it's against Kelleher, who has had a history of getting, submitted by pretty good fighters. And the other being against Benitez, who, was on like a 2-year layoff and literally was rolling off the couch for that fight. But as far as the Perrin side goes, Perrin, I thought, fought somewhat admirably for someone coming in short notice, and he was able to go the distance against Batista. And then against Aoriqileng, that was a very close fight and a completely different stylistic matchup here. But as far as what Jay Perrin can do, he is a pretty well-rounded guy. He can box, he can wrestle, pretty solid grappler as well. From what I have seen, he's pretty hard to control and keep down. The only thing I will say about Perrin, though, is I feel like he does seem to lack a bit of physicality. Even on the regionals, he's getting kind of tossed around there a little bit, and it's kind of hard for him to really impose his will on some of the other fighters. But on the other side of things, I feel like this is a pretty big step up in competition for Rosas. I think that on the feet, Perrin's likely the better striker. The grappling's kind of hard to really say definitively. Perrin is a guy that's pretty hard to hold down. Rosas does seem pretty aggressive there, does seem somewhat physical, but again, we have a very limited sample size that we're working off of here. And you got to factor in that, he is 18 years old. He's only 6-0. He's making his UFC debut after a pretty dominant UFC performance. I feel like there's just so many things that could go wrong here, but stylistically, I think that Perrin could definitely win minutes on the feet with the striking. He's going to try to work his way back up, when he's taken down. I also think that Perrin's got some wrestling upside as well, although I'm not sure if he really wants to take it to the ground with Rosas, because it does seem like Rosas is most comfortable there. He's got a good submission game, and he has hit some pretty nice sweeps and reversals from bottom as well. But really, what has me the most concerned on the Perrin side is he does just really seem to lack a bit of that physicality, and I can definitely see Rosas being able to kind of manhandle him a little bit in the grappling. But at plus 200 for Perrin, I'm willing to pay to find out here. I'm not entirely convinced that Rosas is some generational prospect just yet. Stylistically, this potentially could be a good matchup for him, but I do think that Perrin's got enough, tools here and enough experience here to put up a good, honest fight here. So I'm going to go with Perrin here to pick up the upset. There is a chance he just gets completely washed on the mat here, but with Rosas, making his debut this early in his career, I feel like it's worth a shot here on Perrin. So won't be too upset even if he does get blown out here. But I am going to pick him to win. A very close competitive decision here. And next up, we have Daniel da Silva versus Vinicius Salvador. And Salvador is the minus 190 favorite. Da Silva is the plus 165 underdog. And we have another pretty low-level fight here on our hands. Should be a fun one, though. On one side, we have da Silva, who I guess is a grappler. He does throw some pretty flashy strikes on the feet, but I do think that, generally speaking, he likes to get the fight into the grappling realm. But the issue with da Silva is, well, a few issues, actually. He's just extremely fragile, for one. He doesn't have much of a gas tank, and he's kind of a quitter, too. So, this guy's got the trifecta of being an absolute under machine, which I am looking to target here, but just touching on his opponent real quick, Salvador. This guy's a pretty long, lanky striker. He's got some nice leg kicks. He's generally looking to counter opponents, really likes to taunt them, draw them in, and kind of uses head movement and length to avoid shots. But if I'm being honest, I don't think this guy is as slick as he thinks he is. He's getting bombed on the Contender Series, and it does look like he's got a few knockout losses on the regionals as well. So, it looks flashy, but I'm kind of down the effectiveness of it. But as far as this matchup goes, I do think that Salvador definitely should be the better striker. But as far as the grappling goes, I haven't really liked what I've seen from Salvador. It does look like he can accept being on bottom sometimes. He will throw up elbows and such from bottom. But overall, it does look like his cardio checks out. He's got some power in his hands, although I'd say a lot of his finishes are more so attritional knockouts than they are one-punch knockouts. Usually he's kind of just overwhelming opponents a bit later in fights, especially as they start to slow down, and I can definitely see that happening here. I think Salvador is likely going to get the knockout here. Da Silva kind of seems like a fraud to me at this point. I think that if he doesn't get it done within maybe the first 90 seconds or maybe 2.5 minutes, I'm going to give him a little more credit here. I feel like he is going to be a little screwed here. He might be able to snatch up a submission, maybe hit a takedown, but, if da Silva is able to, or not da Silva, if Salvador is able to stay safe and kind of fight his way out of it, I think he's going to just be able to piece da Silva up, if he's able to get back up. But like I was saying before with da Silva, I think you just got to play the unders with this guy. I don't think he's ever had a fight go past 6 minutes. And he's just got all the traits of an under machine, right? Bad cardio, bad chin, and just being a quitter. So I think the under is very live here. And on top of that, Salvador is a pretty good finisher himself. Granted, he is someone who I think kind of has to build into the fight a little bit, kind of let the damage accumulate. But with da Silva, who's getting one tap by Jeff Molina, who I really don't think is much of a power puncher either, I think an earlier finish is in the cards for Salvador in this fight. So official pick, I'm going to go with Salvador to get a late round one TKO. I think that we see da Silva maybe kind of throw the kitchen sink at him early. I don't know if anything's going to stick, but I think that we see Salvador kind of just start to come on as da Silva starts to gas and look for a way out. So I'm going to go with da Silva to win by round one knockout. But again, with this fight, I do like the under here. It's probably going to be pretty juiced. I wouldn't be surprised if they open the under 1.5 at like minus 200 or something. But with a guy like da Silva who hasn't gone past the 6-minute mark in his career, a guy who's kind of fragile and is a quitter in there, I think it's a very live look. So give me Salvador here to win by round one TKO. And moving along, we have Chris Curtis versus Joaquin Buckley. And Buckley's the minus 130 favorite. Curtis is the plus 110 underdog. And this should be a pretty fun striking affair between two guys who should stand and bang in this fight, honestly. We have Curtis, who is a pretty good boxer, coming into the UFC, had a pretty hot start, and was a decent-sized underdog in a couple of those fights as well, where he pulled off, I think, the upset against Phil Hawes and Brendan Allen. A couple guys who have been around in the UFC, but the fact is, he's really only been matched up against grapplers up until this point. Hawes is a wrestler, and he was actually touching Curtis up before his chin gave out. Brendan Allen, also another grappler with just very little striking defense, and then against Vieira, a submission grappler with I think a very rudimentary striking game as well. And then he did drop a fight against Hermansson, which Hermansson is a grappler, but he has developed a pretty good striking game, and I would give Curtis a bit of a pass here because he was coming in short notice in that fight against a very legit fighter in Hermansson. But the fact is, all his other performances, it has been against guys who aren't really strikers. And with Curtis, it does look like he may have some trouble tracking guys down who are able to move laterally and kind of dip in and out of the pocket, which I feel like Buckley does do a decent job of. He's definitely not as flat-footed as Brendan Allen or even like a Vieira. And Buckley's definitely going to be a much bigger threat on the feet than anyone Curtis has faced so far at the UFC level. Buckley is actually a striker and not, a grappler who's developed a bit of a striking game. On top of that, Buckley actually does have a little bit of wrestling he can kind of fall back to. But with Buckley, he's a pretty tough guy. He's got a bit of power in his hands. And, his cardio actually seems okay for someone his size, and the power that he throws with. And on top of that, he is only 28, has shown a slightly more well-rounded game. I feel like Buckley potentially, could be getting a little better, whereas with Curtis, I feel like he's more or less, his game's kind of rounded out already. This is the best version we've likely already seen from him. So overall, definitely have to lean Buckley in this matchup here. By the numbers, Curtis may have a little more output and volume, but again, it is against these grapplers, that we're getting these stats from, guys who are a little more hittable, guys who aren't as good defensively. I think Buckley's going to be much better defensively than any of these guys that Curtis has fought, minus maybe Hermansson. I think that Buckley's also going to have a bit more of the power edge. I feel like if these guys are swinging at it, I think Buckley's going to be landing the much heavier shots, the much more impactful shots, even if he isn't landing quite as much. And I also feel that Curtis is maybe a bit more of like an attritional guy. I don't think he's got a phenomenal knockout power. He's kind of someone who cooks you and beats you later in the fight and starts to overwhelm you as you start to slow down. And I just don't really see Buckley doing it here. We saw Buckley really start to turn it on against Imavov in his last fight, which I kind of liked seeing. He was down a couple of rounds and he needed to do something big. He needed to make something big happen to win the fight, and I like that he went for it. But ultimately, I just can't unsee Phil Hawes just boxing Curtis up earlier in the fight. And even Vieira was having a good amount of success just landing the same 1-2 over and over. So I think that Buckley's going to be landing the much heavier shots here. I think that Buckley's not going to be as hittable as someone like Allen or be as fragile as someone like Hawes. So I do think that we see Buckley pick up a decision here. I think it's actually going to be kind of competitive on the feet. I don't think Curtis is going to get completely blown out of the water or anything, but I just think it's going to come down to the optics. I feel like Buckley's just going to be landing the way heavier shots and the way more impactful shots. So give me Buckley to win by a decision here. And next up, we have Chris Daukaus versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik. And Rozenstruik is the minus 170 favorite. Daukaus is the plus 145 underdog. And this fight was rescheduled and rebooked. If you want to listen to the full breakdown, you could go to the Darren versus Jan card. I believe that was when it was originally booked. So I'll go over it again, but I'll kind of just summarize the points real quick. So with Daukaus, he's supposedly a well-rounded guy, right? But, at the UFC level, he's really just kind of leaned on his boxing. But he supposedly does have a black belt, which we haven't really seen too much of. But as far as what he brings to the table and what we've seen at the UFC level, he does seem to have some pretty quick hands, pretty good boxing. But, it is worth noting that a lot of the guys he's knocking out are, kind of lower-level guys or guys with, fading chins, slightly older guys as well. And it does appear he may have potentially hit his ceiling at heavyweight. Honestly, I just think that it's an issue of athleticism and the fact that Daukaus just isn't a particularly big heavyweight. I'd need to see him start doing some damage against some higher ranked guys before I changed my mind here. But ultimately, I just think that he lacks maybe a bit of size and strength to really make guys respect him. And it does look like he might not have the durability to really hang with some of the bigger guys at the heavyweight division. And he's going to be going up against one of the heavier hitters in the division in Rozenstruik. Rozenstruik, pretty limited fighter in that he's kind of, knockout reliant or knockdown reliant. More so knockout reliant, right? If he's getting the knockdown, he's probably going to hunt you down and pound you out. But Rozenstruik, he's really reliant on landing that big shot. He's kind of low volume. He kind of can get back down a bit in fights. He lacks a ground game. So, Rozenstruik, he's a pretty one-dimensional fighter, but he does have that equalizer in his hands. And all of his wins at the UFC level have been inside the distance, all by knockout. So if this guy is able to connect, I think he's live to put anyone out. But the issue is sometimes he can just be a little too patient in there, and he could just run out of time, and it'll end up being just a very low output sort of fight from him, which does have me a little concerned for him in this matchup. But I feel like Rozenstruik is going to be able to find the knockout here. Obviously, there is a small chance that this might just be a very low output, a very tepid kickboxing affair, where both guys are maybe a little gun shy, coming off of a knockout, both guys coming off of a knockout. Rozenstruik obviously a little more counter heavy in his style. We see Daukaus maybe just look to, feint and throw leg kicks out there, and it ends up just going the distance. But I don't know if that's super likely. I feel like eventually we see something happen, and I feel like between the two, I think that Rozenstruik's going to be the one to come out ahead in these exchanges. Honestly, I just think that, in terms of the durability, I kind of have to favor Rozenstruik just a little bit more. He has been knocked out before, but it was against guys like Ngannou and Volkov, who have shown pretty good power at the higher level for a heavyweight, whereas with Daukaus, while he is someone with power, good hand speed, he's knocking out kind of lower level guys and guys who are a little more chinny, so I'm not sure if it's entirely translatable here. Obviously, this is heavyweight. Something could get through, and he obviously can hurt Rozenstruik. But between the two, I kind of favored Rozenstruik just a little bit more, and I actually like the power coming from Rozenstruik a little bit more as well. So I got to go with Rozenstruik here to win by round one knockout. Daukaus, he has gotten a few extra months off since they've rebooked it, but at the end of the day, he has been knocked out in his last two fights, all within like the last year or so. So who knows if it's enough time for him to fully recover. And, even if it is, Rozenstruik is a pretty massive hitter himself. So give me Rozenstruik here to win by round one knockout. And moving along, we have TJ Brown versus Erik Silva. And Silva's the minus 145 favorite. Brown is the plus 125 underdog. And with Silva, he is making his UFC debut. Another guy coming off of the Contender Series. A guy who's had a couple of decisions earlier in his career, but has largely been a round one finisher. And the guy fights very aggressively. First round, he's going to look to punch his way into range, really get his grappling going, look to work the ground and pound, soften up his opponents, and then look for the rear naked choke or even just the TKO finish. But that's pretty much Silva's style in a nutshell. But, there definitely are a ton of red flags on his side. One, he's a 35-year-old making his UFC debut. But beyond that, he hasn't had a ton of 3-round experience, and it is against some pretty low-level guys. Some of the records don't look too bad, but overall, I don't think this Lux Fight League is a particularly high-level league, if I'm being honest. And he is going to be going up against TJ Brown, who does have a bit more UFC experience and more experience in general, but if I'm being honest, I've just never really been impressed with this guy. A little while back, I called this guy a fraud, and I think someone got really upset about it, but I'm going to double down here. Brown, while he is a decent wrestler and can box a bit, the guy's cardio is just not really that good. His takedown defense is no good, and his chin is no good either. I'm looking over his record, and his best win is probably Kai Kamaka, but he arguably lost that fight. And he got dropped by a very pillow-fisted Kai Kamaka. A lot of his losses aren't that good either. Jordan Griffin, Danny Chavez, Shailan Nordenbecky, pretty bottom-of-the-barrel guys, if I'm being honest. Getting choked out by Jordan Griffin, getting out-wrestled by Danny Chavez. Not particularly great looks. Neither of those guys with the promotion anymore. Also, those guys are combined 2-7 at the UFC level, and both of those wins are over TJ Brown. But what's really killing me here is the fact that, they made TJ Brown a dog here, which, he does have the UFC experience. He does have a lot more regional experience as well. And his opponent's 35-year-old, making his UFC debut. So, this is a pretty tricky fight in that regards. Really has me torn here. I feel like we've kind of seen the ceiling of TJ Brown, but the issue with Brown also is that I feel like his floor is kind of low. And stylistically speaking, I can see Silva giving Brown a decent bit of trouble. I feel like Silva can overwhelm Brown early. Brown's got pretty poor takedown defense and a pretty bad chin. So, I wouldn't be surprised if Silva was able to take him down and kind of just pound him out early. But I wouldn't be entirely surprised if Silva does end up winning a decision either. If you're getting out-wrestled and out-cardioed by Shailan Nordembeki, I feel like anything's on the table. So even if Silva isn't able to get that round one finish, I think he'd be able to maybe take the second round off and then go back to the wrestling and grappling again in the third round, similar to the Shailan performance. And this is a decent step up in competition for Silva, though. And overall, I do think he's somewhat untested, but I do think he's got the skills and the tools here to pick up a win. So I'm going to go with Silva to win by round one knockout. I think he can get on top of Brown and potentially, ground and pound him out, or just flat out knock him out on the feet, because I really just don't think the chin of Brown is really that good. So give me Silva here to win by round one knockout. And moving along, we have Billy Quarantillo versus Alex Hernandez. And Quarantillo is the minus 160 favorite. Hernandez is the plus 140 underdog. And we'll start with Billy Q, who is, pretty fun fighter to watch, if I'm being honest. He's a guy who's going to look to weaponize his cardio and pace in there, right? Just overwhelm opponents. He can throw a ton of volume on the feet. He can go in there and spam takedowns. And if you're not able to keep up with him, he's going to be able to break you. But there still are some holes in Quarantillo's game. He does leave a lot of openings on the feet. He can get hit. His takedown defense isn't great either. And overall, I do think he lacks a bit of physicality where, against guys who are maybe a little stronger, guys who are a little more technical than him, they're able to kind of impose his will a little bit in there, which is a little worrisome because he's up against Hernandez, who is, a pretty good athlete, pretty strong guy. Very explosive on the feet, pretty big knockout upside. And he has shown he can wrestle and grapple a little bit too, right? But the issue with Hernandez is he has had a history of kind of just tapering off and falling apart later in fights. You look at his losses at the UFC level, and 3 or 4 of them, he's getting finished in the second round. And even in the Moises fight, which that was a pretty weird fight, if I'm being honest. It looked like Hernandez may have been coasting a bit in that fight. It looked like maybe he thought he was doing a lot better than he was, but he ended up just losing, I think, a somewhat clear 30-27 fight. It wasn't like a complete blowout by any means, even though it was a 30-27, but I just thought Moises did a little bit more in every single round. But yeah, that was a really weird performance. But if you look at the guys that Hernandez, he's losing to, it's guys like Cerrone, guys like Dober, guys like Moicano, and even Moises. All of these guys are, I'd say, reasonably technical on the feet. I know the Cerrone loss wasn't great, but, this was before Cerrone just completely fell off a cliff. And overall, I just feel that a lot of these guys that Hernandez is losing to overall are guys who are pretty reasonably technical on the feet, pretty good defensively, and are actually pretty legit fighters, at least from a technical standpoint. So I feel like you guys probably already know where I'm going with this. I definitely feel that Hernandez is very alive in this matchup, which is interesting, right? Because when they first announced this, I thought this was Billy Q all day, right? I thought that he'd be able to just come in here and just completely smother Hernandez with his pace and his pressure and just break him in the second or third round. And of course, that can happen, but after watching a bit more tape, I'm definitely not as confident as I was, when they first announced the matchup here. And there are a couple main reasons for that, right? One is I feel like Billy Q is very, very hittable. Like I was saying before, a lot of the guys beating Hernandez, they're actually, quite good, defensively speaking. Whereas with Billy Q, this guy kind of blocks punches with his face. I think that there's a chance we see Hernandez just land something big and put him out. And even if he isn't able to knock Billy Q out, I feel like he could do some big damage, maybe knock him down, and at least win the round that way. And the other thing with Quarantillo is, he's got pretty subpar takedown defense. He can get taken down and controlled in the grappling. And I know people are going to say, Hernandez might not have the cardio to go 3 rounds here, especially if he's mixing in the wrestling. But, he has done it before. He did beat OAM using his wrestling and grappling. And OAM is a pretty solid, well-rounded fighter who actually just recently won $1 million on PFL. So a very good win there for Hernandez, going to his wrestling and his grappling. Billy Q, he's also been repeatedly taken down by a much smaller Gavin Tucker. But I'd say a more relevant performance is probably the Spike Carlisle fight where, Carlisle, not a big cardio guy himself, was able to hit takedowns and rack up control time against Billy Q. Billy was able to, I think, win the second round just throwing up a bit more volume on bottom, but that is a pretty risky maneuver here. I feel like with Hernandez, if he is just raining down a little more ground and pound and he's on top of you, that's going to be enough to kind of mitigate any sort of damage you're doing on bottom. And again, there's going to be, I think, a pretty big physicality difference between the two. I think that Hernandez is just going to be the way stronger, way more physical guy in there, especially since he's moving down to 145. He should have the size advantage. I think tail of the tape, he's actually a little shorter, but the guy's just way more ripped up. Him moving down to 145 is a little concerning. We're going to have to see how the cardio holds up, but, he still is kind of early in his career. I don't know if it's going to affect him that much, but he should have a pretty big size advantage coming into this fight. In any case, I am going to pick Hernandez to win here. I think he's got a number of paths to victory. I feel like, the market may also be a little low on him just because he hasn't had the best performances. He's blowing a lot of these lower level guys out of the water. But once he gets that step up, he does seem to falter a little bit. But I do think he's got the tools here to succeed. I think he's live for an early knockout, and I think he's also live to maybe hit takedowns and rack up control time as well to kind of mitigate the output of Quarantillo. So official pick for this fight, I am going to go with Hernandez. As far as how he gets it done, I'll go with decision, but I wouldn't be surprised if he gets the round 1 knockout either. So give me Hernandez to win by decision. And next up we have Edmen Shahbazyan versus Dalcha Lungiambula. Shahbazyan's the minus 300 favorite. Lungiambula's the plus 260 underdog. And we'll start with Shahbazyan first. A little easier breakdown in my opinion. This guy in a nutshell, he is a pretty dangerous striker in the first round, but it seems like he's kind of turning into a round 1 knockout or bust sort of guy. Up until the Brunson fight, he was on a pretty long finishing streak, just finishing guys very quickly in the first round. But since then, his cardio and his ground game's just gotten completely exposed. The guy's just completely fallen apart after the first round. And we haven't really seen anything in between. And he's going to be going up against Dalcha, who is someone who is a bit gassy himself. But at the end of the day, Dalcha has actually gone 3 rounds before and not looked like complete ass in there. But with Dalcha, he is a big jacked up dude. Kind of low volume on the feet, but, he'll throw hammers in there. Lots of power on the feet, lots of raw power. And he does have a decent takedown game. Not the most active guy on top, a bit of a lay-in prayer. Unless, it's against a very low-level guy like a Townsend or something. But beyond that, he's not a very active guy on top if he does take you down. But with Dalcha, he is 35 years old now. And, coming off of 2 finishes in a row, I do have some doubts as to his durability at this point. But, this is still a very weird fight because we have 2 guys who have pretty subpar cardio. The fight could get pretty interesting if it does get past that first round. Could become a bit of a coin toss fight if I'm being honest. I think Dalcha maybe can have a bit of success in the clinch. Might even be able to hit some takedowns. But I do actually think that Shahbazyan's pretty live for an early finish here, especially if Dalcha's chin may be a little cracked. So I guess the pick is Shahbazyan. He is dangerous early. He is the much younger fighter. He definitely could be making improvements to his cardio, but, I wouldn't be banking on it here, especially not at minus 300. This is something, you'll kind of have to see to believe. But as of right now, I guess I'll have to pick Shahbazyan to win by round 1 knockout. Definitely would not recommend laying any sort of juice on this guy. You just can't lay minus 300 on a guy who really hasn't had any success past that first round. I don't think this guy's looked good whatsoever past, I think, like the 5-minute mark. So I can't parlay him. I can't lay any sort of juice on this guy, but I will pick him to win by round 1 knockout. But, not a ton of confidence, if I'm being honest. And next up, we have Bryce Mitchell versus Ilia Topuria. And Topuria is the minus 165 favorite. Mitchell's the plus 145 underdog. And this is a pretty good matchup here. It should be a grappler's delight. Two very high-level guys going at it. Really interested to see how this plays out. But on the Topuria side, I'd say he's probably the slightly less proven of the two, but probably the more dangerous striker. He's got pretty good boxing, very explosive on the feet. He's got good takedowns, and he's got a very dangerous submission game as well. On top of that, he's a very physical guy. The only thing so far is, I do still have some questions as to whether or not Topuria's got 3 rounds in him, especially if he's pushing the grappling hard. He is a very strong, very explosive guy. I would imagine it's kind of taxing on the cardio for him. I know he did go to a decision against Zalal, but Zalal, in my opinion, is just a pretty noodly guy who hasn't really been able to beat anyone that can't grapple. So I would like to see Topuria extended a little more before saying anything conclusive, though. But I'm pretty sure in this matchup we're going to see Mitchell push him pretty hard here because, Mitchell, in my opinion, is a very good grappler himself. But, if I'm being honest, I wasn't quite sold on this guy until the Feely performance because up until that point he's had some pretty close fights against guys like Tyler Diamond and Bobby Moffitt, and he even got submitted in the 3rd round against Katona. But these guys, in my opinion, in hindsight at least, are somewhat underrated fighters, very tough, gritty guys who are able to go hard for 3 rounds. And I feel like since then, Bryce has gotten better. And, he's coming into his prime. And I feel like those are performances you kind of level up from, performances where you do get better from, you learn from. And in those fights, he was pushed very hard in the grappling. And he still was able to find a way to win, which I do think this is something you can build off of. Whereas with Topuria, I feel like he hasn't quite been pushed that way in the grappling yet. And I do think Bryce is really gonna bring it to him in terms of the grappling. And between the two, I kind of favor Bryce down the stretch. I do like the stand-up of Topuria a bit more. I think he's got a bit more finishing upside early in the fight. I think he could definitely hurt Bryce Mitchell on the feet. He may even be able to sub him. Topuria is a very dangerous submission grappler, but I have seen Bryce fight out of some pretty deep submission attempts before. But Topuria is pretty dangerous, so I wouldn't be completely surprised if he was able to find the finish early. But I don't know if it's super likely here. But should this fight get past that 1st round, I kind of do favor Mitchell a bit more going into that 2nd and 3rd round. I honestly think this will be the most Topuria's grappling and cardio will be tested to date. So official pick, I am going to go with Mitchell here. Overall, I kind of see this being a pretty 50-50 fight. But I think at the end of the day, I think we see the experience come through. Mitchell's been in a ton of, gritty 3-rounders, whereas Topuria really has only been in 1. And, Zalal's grappling is just not even on the level of someone like Mitchell. I think there's going to be some pretty crazy exchanges on the ground, but I feel like at the end of the day, we see Mitchell come out on top here. I think I just got to go with the guy who's fought through a bit more adversity. I feel like his, UFC experience is a little more relevant compared to Topuria's in this matchup. I've seen him push through in these tough, gritty 3-round fights. I've seen him eat a knee to the face by Feely and still continue to push the wrestling and grappling. So I got to go with Mitchell to get it done here. I think he wins a very competitive fight. I think he wins a decision here. I think that 2nd round is actually going to be where the tide really starts to turn. But overall, I got to favor or slightly favor Mitchell to get it done here. So give me Mitchell here. Give me Mitchell to win by decision. And moving along, we have Dricus du Plessis versus Darren Till. And du Plessis is the minus 140 favorite. Till is the plus 120 underdog. And this is a pretty interesting fight here. I think it's pretty good matchmaking. It does appear like the UFC may potentially be selling a bit on the Darren Till stock. Either Darren Till is able to to get the win here and get back on track, or he's able to give some of the shine to Du Plessis, who's been on a bit of a heater since coming into the UFC. But as far as this matchup goes, it's going to likely be a striking affair. But if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you'll know that I just don't have a particularly great read on Du Plessis. I've always felt that his striking is just a bit clunky and awkward, very herky-jerky. And I keep thinking that someone is going to knock him out pretty bad here, but he has been able to get it done at the UFC level so far. He's shown some, decent power in his hands. He's got a decent kicking game. And so far, it just seems like opponents haven't quite been able to figure him out yet. And at this point, I've kind of just accepted it. I feel like he's been able to make it work, and ultimately what matters is he's been able to find a way to win. Whereas with Till, he's kind of had a bit of a fall from grace, right? Being a title contender at one point to now being 1-4 of his last 5. 3 of those losses by finish, with his only win being over a split over Kelvin Gastelum. But the fact is, I feel like Till is just still a very limited fighter. He's got kind of low volume on the feet, a bit more of a counter striker with a dangerous left hand. But beyond that, he hasn't really added too many layers to his game. The takedown defense seems like a bit of a liability at this point as well. But taking a look at this matchup, I do feel that Till's going to have some opportunities to maybe land something big here. Because I've been saying it for a long time. I feel like Du Plessis, he just kind of leaves his chin out there. He doesn't react particularly well to getting hit either. And Till, I do still think is still a pretty dangerous striker. The thing is, he's just been kind of inactive. We haven't really seen the power really translate, at middleweight until he has struggled with injuries and making weight. And he's actually going to be the slightly smaller guy in this matchup. And I just feel like Du Plessis kind of the guy with the momentum here, making his UFC debut on a 3-fight win streak at the UFC level. Much longer win streak than that if you're taking into account the regional scene. Whereas with Till, he's been on a bit of a skid, and granted, it's against some pretty good guys, but nonetheless, he is skidding right now. He's kind of struggling making it into the octagon. So for those reasons, I am kind of slightly leaning the Du Plessis side. But beyond that, I do think that on the feet, we're going to see maybe a little more volume from Du Plessis as well. He's got some nice leg kicks. He does a great job of pumping out the jab as well. He's going to be the slightly taller, longer guy, and the guy is kind of bricked up. He's not much of a wrestler or grappler, but against Till, that is something he could probably test out, may even have a bit of success. I'm not banking on it or anything, but after seeing Till on his back, it definitely is worth a shot here. So I'm going to go with Du Plessis here, maybe to win by decision. Not super convicted about this fight by any means. But something I might also look at here is maybe Till by knockout, just because I keep having this hunch that Du Plessis is going to get knocked out, and I do feel that of all of his opponents so far at the UFC level, Till is probably the most dangerous, but Till honestly hasn't looked great, I think, in like 4 or 5 fights, so I'm going to go with Du Plessis here. I think he wins a volume-based decision over Till, so give me Du Plessis to win by decision. And moving along, we have Robbie Lawler versus Santiago Ponzinibbio, and Ponzinibbio's the minus 400 favorite. Lawler's the plus 300 underdog. Pretty straightforward fight, if I'm being honest. Not one I have any particularly hot take on. We have Ponzinibbio, who I think is more of a finesse type of striker. Someone who's going to use his footwork and distance management to kind of, strike opponents at distance, pick them apart there, find openings, pressure, and just outpace opponents. He is 1-3 of his last 4, but 2 of those 3 losses really could have gone the other way. Those are very competitive fights against very good guys. So while I do think that Ponzinibbio is on a bit of a decline, I think that he's not completely washed yet, and I feel like he does have a few more good performances left in the tank. Whereas with Lawler, on the other hand, definitely a bit more washed, if I'm being honest. Offensively speaking, he still is pretty good. He's got some power. The boxing's good, but the cardio's gone, the durability's gone, and his style just does not really age well, especially once the durability starts to go. He's an action fighter who just can't quite take a punch anymore and doesn't really have the cardio to sustain that sort of pace and output. So unless he's able to knock Ponzinibbio out early here, I think we see Ponzinibbio just out volume and outwork him later in the fight, maybe even be able to overwhelm him in the second and third round. I don't know how much power Ponzi still has in his hands. He was a pretty dangerous fighter, before the layoff, but I don't know how much of that he still has. Granted, he did fight some pretty tough dudes in Pereira and Neal, but Baez is kind of getting starched left and right here, and Ponzi wasn't really able to do a significant amount of damage to him. He was able to put the volume on him, but I don't know if he's got quite the sting that he used to have. That said, though, if Lawler does start to slow down significantly, I can see Ponzinibbio getting a late finish here. So official pick, I'm going to go with Ponzinibbio to win by round 3 knockout. And in the co-main event, we have Paddy Pimblett versus Jared Gordon. And Pimblett is the -200 favorite. Gordon's the +170 underdog. And this is pretty good matchmaking, in my opinion. Pimblett getting a decent step up in competition, but still, I think, a pretty good test for him. Pimblett definitely riding a bit of hype at this point. This guy might actually be the biggest draw on this card. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he got a bigger pop than Blachowicz and Ankalaev. But beyond all that, he is a pretty good grappler. He's got some pretty solid attributes as well. I think his 3-round cardio checks out. The only time he's really slowed down, I feel like, is in 5-rounders, but he does usually push a pretty hard pace in there. I'd say the biggest knock on him is probably a striking defense. He's been getting clipped and dropped and hurt, but he's never actually been knocked out. He's actually shown pretty good recoverability. I know when he does get that step up against more dangerous strikers, it'll definitely be a little more dicey for him, but as of right now, I do think that he's got a good enough chin and durability for him to kind of continue to ride that hype. And for what it's worth, I don't know if Gordon's really a massive knockout threat on the feet. Anyways, with Pimblett, he does actually do a pretty good job of getting the fights to the mat, and on the ground, he is a pretty slippery dude, pretty tricky in transitions, and he is quite aggressive with the submissions and the ground and pound attempts. And the UFC, again, is giving him, I'd say, a pretty suitable step up in competition here. Gordon, while he isn't exactly a world beater by any means, is a very good litmus test for anyone who's on the come up. He's a very solid, well-rounded guy who's, tough and has good cardio. So, he's very good at just testing you in all aspects of MMA. But the thing is, I just don't think Gordon is particularly dangerous anywhere. And I've always felt that Gordon was a bit of a weight bully at 145, and at 155, I'm not sure if the advantages are quite as pronounced there. The cardio seems to maybe be a little bit better, maybe the durability as well. But this is definitely going to be Pimblett's toughest test for sure. Gordon is someone who is kind of hard to hold down. He's constantly making you work. He's got some takedown upside of his own, and I think that between the two, he might actually be the slightly more, technical boxer. But Pimblett, as we've seen, does seem to have a bit of power on the feet. It's just that, he's generally preferred to grapple in there. And something worth noting, though, is that Gordon has actually been fighting a lot of grapplers lately. I think his last 3 fights have been against guys who are grapplers. I know Santos is a bit more of a knockout guy at this point, but he is a very potent grappler, and the path to victory in that fight was to keep it standing and just to outwork outwork Santos on the feet, which he did do very well there. So this will actually be, I think, his 4th camp now in a row where he's probably drilling his takedown defense and grappling. So I can kind of see Gordon being the value side here. If anyone that bet Levitt at +200 probably should bet Gordon here, because I do feel that Gordon's just a much better version of Levitt, stylistically speaking, right? And he's got better cardio. So I feel like there is potentially value there, at least on paper. But what's really keeping me off of Gordon in this spot is that at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of these grapplers are actually having success against Gordon. Dawson was able to take him down at will and rack up control time. And was able to get a late finish. Selecki was having success there as well. And I feel like what really swung that fight was just a knee to the face. I think it was the 2nd round. It really swung the momentum of that fight, and Gordon was able to edge a very close decision there. But Selecki was having a ton of success in the grappling, and The cardio of Selecki, I think, is a little more questionable than I'd say Pimblett or even Dawson's. Of course, these guys are pretty good grapplers, but I do think that Pimblett is a pretty solid grappler in his own right. And, seeing these guys have success against Gordon makes me think that Paddy can have pretty similar success as well. So I feel like he can get the fight there to the ground. And on the mat, I think Paddy's going to be able to get the better of Gordon in a lot of these exchanges. And I think Paddy's going to have the cardio to not just completely fall off a cliff after the second round. So I'm going to go with Pimblett here to pick up the dub. I think he can get it done by decision, or maybe even a late finish, because I kind of do feel like Gordon is, historically he's had, I'd say, pretty good cardio, but I feel like it is starting to, taper off a little bit. And, Paddy is someone who is, I'd say, pretty aggressive in there. So, official pick, I'll just go with Pimblett to win by decision. And in the main event, we have a short notice title fight between Jan Blachowicz and Magomed Ankalaev. Ankalaev's the minus 255 favorite. Blachowicz is the plus 215 underdog. And this fight was originally going to be the co-main event. It was initially scheduled for 3 rounds, so them adding another 2 rounds to it, and it also being a title fight, does make things a little more interesting. But we'll take a look at the Blachowicz side first. So with Blachowicz, he is a pretty well-rounded fighter at this point in his career. But overall, I'd say his style is, he is more of a counter striker, and there's someone who's pretty good at, capitalizing on the mistakes of opponents. He's going to look to pump the jab out and throw kicks to stay busy. But generally speaking, I think he is a somewhat low-volume striker. I will say this, though. It does look like he's sitting down a bit more on his shots lately. Obviously, he's had a nice little finish streak at one point. But even against Rakic, it looked like some of the power was getting to Rakic a little bit there. Rakic for sure was respecting the power that was coming from Blachowicz. And on top of that, Blachowicz can wrestle a bit. He's a proficient grappler. But the big hole in Blachowicz's game is it's got to be the takedown defense. And once he is taken down, he can kind of accept being on bottom. There was a period of time where, it didn't really get tested and we didn't really have to worry about it. But it was a weakness that was kind of there earlier in his career, and it kind of showed its head again in his last 2 fights. We saw Rakic kind of exploited a bit before his knees just completely exploded. But going into this fight, I feel like this can be exploited here by Ankalaev, who is, a capable wrestler. But the question really is, is he going to go to the wrestling, and, is he prepared to do it for 3 out of the 5 rounds? Because outside of the Krylov fight, we haven't really seen Ankalaev really, aggressively wrestle or grapple. And this being a short notice 5 rounder, you have to wonder if he's fully prepared to do so for, 3 out of the 5 rounds, right? In a 3 rounder, I'd be a little more confident in him, but over 5 rounds, it is a little more questionable, especially since they only announced this, I think a couple weeks ago. But I do think that the wrestling and the grappling is going to be the clearest path to victory for him on the feet. Ankalaev is a very good technical striker as well, but he can be a bit on the low volume side. Ankalaev, he is a bit of a counterpuncher himself, so, this fight could potentially devolve into just being a pretty low volume kind of staring contest between the two. Both guys looking to counter, not really overcommitting to anything, so I feel like it's got a big potential of being a snooze fest here. I'm hoping it's not, I'm hoping someone does get clipped, but I feel like this likely goes the distance. Overall, I kind of do have to favor Ankalaev. He's going to be the much younger fighter. He's got the wrestling upside, which I think is going to be key here. And on the feet, while I feel like it's going to be, pretty competitive, I feel like, over the course of 5 rounds, we're going to see Ankalaev maybe just land a little bit more. He might just be a little quicker, a little sharper in there. Although I feel like it is going to be pretty close standing. But again, I think the clearest path to victory and the path of least resistance in this fight is going to be in the wrestling. I feel like with a properly timed takedown, he could potentially just ride out the rest of the round on top of Blachowicz. If Rakic is able to just top time you like that, I think Ankalaev shouldn't have too much issue. But again, the short notice 5 round nature of it does have me a little more skeptical. But on the other hand, this is going to be a short notice 5 rounder for Jan as well. And there's a chance we do see Jan start to slow down a bit as well, especially, if he's just kind of attacking from bottom. So, this is a pretty, annoying fight in that regards, but I do think that Ankalaev should get it done here. The striking should be competitive. I might slight lean towards Ankalaev, but I really think it's going to be the wrestling that is what really puts stamps on rounds and what really will allow Ankalaev to really pull ahead on the scorecard. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Ankalaev to win by decision and be the new light heavyweight champ. And that'll do it for the breakdown portion of the podcast, which will bring us into the recap for the previous event, which we haven't done in a little while here. And what an event to be coming back to, one where I've just gotten completely thrashed in. I had a few small parlays and, props that cash, but I think all the money line plays kind of shit the bed. But yeah, without further ado, let's get right into the breakdowns, or the recap, actually. So right off the night, Yasmin Yargui versus Estela Nunez. At first I thought the line was off, but seeing the fight play out, it felt like the line was kind of correct. Even with the knockdown, it didn't look like Nunez was able to do much with it. I don't even think she was really close to finishing Yasmin. And come that second round, Yasmin was really starting to pour it on Nunez. And that was pretty much it. After she got the knockdowns, there was no way Nunez was coming back from that, in my opinion. But next up, Marcela Rojo versus Francis Marshall. And I did pick and bet Rojo here to win. Just a case of kind of fading a guy who's somewhat unproven, getting that step up in competition, making his debut. And Marshall, he definitely proved me wrong here. He was eating some shots there, but he's still a young and tough kid and very tenacious. Was able to get the job done. And I feel if they bring him up slowly and they don't give him, too many killers, I feel like, once he rounds out his game a bit more, he could be someone who hangs around at the UFC level, maybe even break into the top 15, because he does appear to have some pretty good attributes, right? He's tough. He's got good cardio. He's got a bit of power in his hands. And of course, he does have the wrestling to go to as well. So, he could go far as long as they're not rushing him too quickly. But moving along, Natan Levy, Genaro Valdez. And I didn't really have any sort of action on this fight. I did pick Levy to win, but I wasn't supremely confident in him. Obviously, he did get the job done, but I felt like if Valdez had actually fought like he typically does, he might have actually had a better chance, because some of the shots that were landing was when Valdez was being aggressive and moving forward. So I feel like if he had just kind of swarmed Levy early, he might have found a finish potentially, but I don't know. He decided to fight smart, but he's not really a technical fighter sort of type, and he got kind of picked apart and taken down and got, beat in a pretty sound decision here. And if I'm being honest, I don't think either guy's going to be long for the UFC. I think Levy might, he might get another contract, but Valdez, unless he does something crazy, is probably going to get cut in a fight or two. But moving along, Darren Elkins, Jonathan Pierce. I think I ended up parlaying Pierce. I think the parlay didn't come through anyways, but I think I needed a third leg. So yeah, I just threw Pierce in there. I did feel the line was a tad wide, but ultimately I felt like he should have just gotten the win here. And I mean, he did make somewhat easy work of Elkins. Was able to volume him up on strikes, was able to hit takedowns. Not a particularly great look from Pierce in the sense that, he was able to land, I think, 100 plus significant strikes on Elkins and wasn't really close to putting him out, which I think may have been a little shocking, but I feel like it does make sense in hindsight. Pierce is not exactly a potent striker, or a very dangerous striker for that matter. He's more of a guy who's just going to overwhelm you and finish you if you aren't able to keep up. And, Elkins is a very generally, tough dude with good cardio. So it was kind of hard for Pierce to really overwhelm him there. Although, he did put a pretty nasty beating on Elkins. So maybe just something worth considering, moving forward with Pierce. I feel like he'll have to have a decent cardio edge on someone to get that finish. Anyways, moving along, Michael Johnson, Mark DeCasey. So I did have DeCasey in the parlay, and obviously the thought process was he'd just go in there and spam takedowns, and he did go in there, and he did attempt takedowns, but what honestly surprised me even more was just how hard he gassed out. I think halfway through the second round, it looked like he just completely fell off a cliff. So a bit surprising there, but I mean, DeCasey has kind of shit the bed before as a favorite. So moving along, we have Clay Guida, Scott Holtzman. So I did pick Guida, but I didn't end up betting him. I was rooting for Clay in this fight, and Just a pretty solid, well-rounded performance from him. I did say Guida's got a way to kind of weasel his way through these striking exchanges. It didn't look like he was landing the biggest shots or anything, but it looked like he was just working a lot more in there. And, he did have some pretty big moments with the takedowns. Pretty impressive, if I'm being honest. 40 years old, picking up a much bigger Scott Holtzman and slamming him, and still being able to push a pretty hard pace over the course of 3 rounds. This guy is legit built different. I'm really hoping the UFC just continues to give him these veteran matchups. He is a fan favorite, and would hate to see him get put out by a younger guy. But moving along, Angela Hill versus Emily Ducote. And this fight was actually a bit surprising to me. I thought it'd be a lot more competitive. Ended up just taking the over in this fight. Didn't end up, betting either side. I thought it'd just be really back and forth, and it'd be somewhat even. Did not expect Hill to just completely blow Ducote out of the water here. Ducote just didn't have any sort of answers at distance. She didn't have any answers in the clinch. I was getting a little concerned that the over wouldn't even cash because Angela Hill was just piecing Ducote up and just landing some pretty vicious knees in the clinch. But unfortunately for Hill, and I guess fortunately for me, she just doesn't have that sort of power. And, good on Ducote for being that tough. But, man, just a complete domination on Hill's part. I guess congratulations to anyone who bet Hill in this spot. I think she ended up closing as a dog in this fight, too, which, pretty crazy. But solid performance by Hill. Ducote, I have no idea. I don't know what they're going to do with her moving forward. Next up, Nico Price, Phil Rowe. Initially I had a slight lean towards Price, but I ended up playing Phil Rowe inside the distance small just because the number was a bit better. I think Phil Rowe ITD was about plus 200, and then Nico Price ITD was only about like plus 130 or something. And I felt like both guys are pretty live for the finish. Price coming off of a somewhat long layoff. Wasn't aware that he had double knee surgery, which kind of, shifted me a bit more on the Rowe side, combined with the fact that the number was just a bit better. And I feel like overall Rowe, he's got a bit of submission upside as well. Supposedly, black belt with those long, lanky arms, always live for a guillotine or like a Darce or something. Obviously, he was able to just find the knockout. Yeah, pretty crazy fight, though. I think Nico Price kind of screwed up, unloading the clip a bit early in the 3rd round. You kind of want to wait towards a bit later in the round before you unload the clip. But I wasn't expecting Rowe to be able to just pop back up and then, pour it on Price. But it looked like Price may have just really gassed himself out going for it. Anyways, yeah, that was a good fight. I was able to make back a little money there, but still, pretty big in the hole at this point. Anyways, moving along, Erik Anders, Cal Daukaus. I had picked Anders, but I ended up not betting this fight. I did feel that Daukaus just kind of lacked a bit of physicality, and it really showed in this fight, man. Daukaus just, he looked good on the feet. He looked like the way more technical striker, but it just looked like Anders wasn't really respecting any of the power coming from Daukaus at all. And in hindsight, it kind of does make sense because we've seen Anders eat some big shots from Khalil Roundtree and other much heavier hitters. So these strikes from Daukaus probably didn't faze him too much. And I actually did play Daukaus small for the submission. I did feel that if this fight somehow did hit the ground, he could potentially snatch something up. Anders, not a particularly great grappler, but he does have pretty good takedown defense, and he was able to stuff the takedowns, and it did ultimately come down to the physicality. I think, Daukaus really just wasn't able to impose his game plan. But moving along, Jack Hermansson, Roman Dolidze, and this one hurt the most because, I did get in at a pretty good price on Hermansson, and, he was looking pretty good on the feet. Had he kept it on the feet, he probably would have won. I'd say a pretty clear decision, but props to Dolidze. I was definitely, not giving him any sort of respect in terms of the grappling. I thought Hermansson would be able to kind of handle him there. But Dolidze was able to hit some pretty insane sweeps and pull off another pretty crazy finish. I don't think I'm going to be as eager to fade this guy going forward, but who knows? If they completely overrate him going into his next matchup, I may have to take a shot. But it's really going to have to be dependent on the matchup here. But moving along, Tai Tuivasa, Sergey Pavlovich. I did have the under parlayed in this fight. I figured these guys are likely going to swing in there. And that's kind of what they did. Pavlovich just came out there and kind of just walked Tuivasa down. Was able to keep his composure and avoid the big shots coming back from Tuivasa and eventually get the finish. I don't know if that was a great fight for Tuivasa. I honestly think he should have maybe taken a little more time off before rushing in there with a very dangerous striker in Pavlovich. But Pavlovich looked really good in there. The guy's absolutely electric to watch. I think the fight to make really is Pavlovich versus Ngannou. Pavlovich versus Gan would be interesting, but I feel like in terms of just the hype and the potential like excitement in a fight, I think having two heavy hitters go at it is a little more exciting than having a heavy hitter versus like a technician go at it. Just my opinion, though. Anyways, moving along, Matheus Nicolau versus Matt Schnell. And honestly, I thought this was one where Schnell would be a little more competitive in, and up until the knockdowns, it kind of was, but it looked like Nicolau was just able to get the timing of Schnell down pretty quickly there, and then just find the button. Obviously, the chin of Schnell, not particularly great, but this is one I'd actually like to rewatch. I feel like Nicolau may have seen something in there, picked up on a pattern of Schnell's, because I think he might have hit like the same shot coming in twice on Schnell. But anyways, Nicolau was able to get it done there. Probably due for a title shot soon. But next up in the co-main, Bryan Barberena, RDA. Yeah, so I wasn't supremely surprised by this. I think a lot of people expected RDA to just go in there and take Barberena down at will. I did too. I played RDA small for the sub as well. I figured, if he's going to top time Barberena, and, RDA being the grappler that he is going to look for these submissions, and he was able to get it done in there. Barberena did put up a bit more resistance than I had expected, but, it does make a bit of sense. RDA is moving up, and while Barberena isn't exactly the biggest welterweight, he is giving up a bit of size here, and, he's going to have to work a little harder to take someone like Barberena down. But at the end of the day, he did get the job done. And lastly, in the main event, Kevin Holland, Stephen Thompson, and I did have Holland in the spot, did bet him as well. Kind of a frustrating fight, not because of the injury. I do think that the injury that Holland got was probably a result of Thompson just landing those, kicks over and over and over again. But I'd say it's more so just Holland's fight IQ. I'd say that definitely, lost him the fight there. I think in the second and third round, he had an opportunity to get on top of Thompson and potentially ride out the round, or at least really put a stamp on the round. I'm not going to say, it would have won him the fight, but I do think that in not doing that, it definitely lost him those rounds, because he was losing the striking exchanges to Thompson. But up until those moments, it was close enough to the point where had Holland had decided to initiate the grappling, or at least, not let Thompson stand up, he probably would have been up 3-0 going into the fourth and fifth, likely not have hurt his hand, and probably could have just survived in the last two rounds and won a 48-47 decision. So kind of frustrating there, but I guess the fight IQ thing is kind of cooked into this Kevin Holland line. Granted, I did get him at around pick'em, which I feel like is actually still not the worst odds ever. Especially had he just gone to the wrestling and the grappling a bit earlier. I think he would have had a very good chance of winning this fight. Not to mention, he did have Wonder Boy hurt early in the fight as well. But good for Wonder Boy for picking up the win here, a much-needed win for him. Ideally, he gets matched up with more strikers going forward, because I do think the grappling and the wrestling is going to be very exploitable for future opponents. But against strikers, I do think that Wonder Boy is capable of still putting on some pretty fun, exciting fights. Anyways, that's it for this podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed the content. Best of luck with your guys' picks and bets, and I'll catch you next week for the last card of the year in Strickland versus Cannonier.